Hey everyone, welcome to this week's release of the Hashrate Happy Hour podcast. On today's show, I'm joined by Zach Bradford, the CEO and co-founder of CleanSpark. We had an awesome conversation talking about the early days of CleanSpark, the key problem with the argument that the energy generators are going to take over the Bitcoin mining industry, and we wrap up with a discussion about some of the challenges Bitcoin mining may face in the future when it comes to its energy consumption. Zach drops an absolute ton of great insight during this episode, so you're really going to want to make sure that you stick around for the entire episode. Today's podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, the Texas Blockchain Council, a Bitcoin-first nonprofit industry organization working to make Texas the jurisdiction of choice for Bitcoin mining and blockchain innovation. They will be hosting North America's premier policy conference for Bitcoin and the digital asset ecosystem on November 15th through the 17th in Fort Worth, Texas. For more information, please visit their website at texasblockchaincouncil.org. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Like I said in the introduction, I'm here with Zach Bradford with CleanSpark. Zach, welcome to the show.
Ben, thanks for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. And just like the last that we were chatting before we hit record, I hope that the technology works out for us here. I think we're going to be okay.
Yeah, I think we're going to get it right this time. So, technology is that way. So.
Yeah, one of these days I'll get my podcasting stuff all upgraded. It's all on my end, so I appreciate the patience with it, Zach. What I like to do to kick the show off is I like to walk through your background and especially what led you into Bitcoin mining, because we're kind of a niche within a niche. So I'd love to hear your background and how that led you to Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, I've got a background in, finance, but I've also have a background in energy. So when CleanSpark actually started, Matt and I, we co-founded the company and we were focused on energy. And as we built that energy company, ultimately we were always focused on the intersection of, the value the energy brings, optimization of that energy, how to basically essentially make use of as much of the energy that you generate or store as possible. So we had, in 2016, we acquired a software company to kind of add to our stack and built from there. And so got introduced to some people in late 2019 and then early 2020. I flew down to Atlanta and visited a data center. And we had done data center work in the energy space in the past. It had all been traditional data centers. Mm-hmm. A lot of it was military based. And in coming to this data center, I just figured it was just like any other. But when I arrived, found it to be very different. That was my very first exposure to Bitcoin mining. And as I started talking with the owner about why they were looking to optimize their energy, and it was all about how do we drive the lowest cost energy to drive revenue? And that was one of the first times that there'd ever been a conversation with an owner of a facility or property where they were talking about it driving revenue instead of just savings. Because the more energy they can get, the quicker they can get it, all of the above, because they were looking to expand and build.
Yeah.
I was still a Bitcoin skeptic at the time, but it was interesting and probably got lucky that the pandemic, really kicked off in full force about 2 or 3 months later. So just like many of us, with the pandemic, we got stuck in our houses, and it gives you definitely the time to go down the rabbit hole. So I dove clearly very deep down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And ultimately ended up going to my board of directors and saying, hey, the energy business is going well. We'd actually been on a trajectory of, doubling revenue or nearly doubling revenue multiple years in a row. And we're looking to stay on that path. And I said, I think actually, and at the time I said we should build both. And then subsequently, a few months into actually Bitcoin mining, I said, we got to go all in. But, really understanding the value proposition of Bitcoin, I really don't think that there's anything else in, human existence right now in which energy transfers better value, like from a trade-off point of view, value in, utility, value in access to, financial tools, all of that. Like Bitcoin really can change the world, but it also drives true growth in the energy space. So,
Yeah.
really abundance in energy. So that was my beginning point is the intersection is coming from the energy side.
That's fantastic. And a lot of what you just said is actually what drove me to start the podcast in the first place is really, you go down the rabbit hole, you just, if you look at Bitcoin mining long enough, you eventually realize that this is all moving to the point of generation, and that this is going to be one of those like once in a lifetime type tools that is going to come to the electrical grid, probably since, some of the first alternating current generators were ever invented and created back in like the 1890s. So it's really phenomenal. I'm excited about it for all the same reasons. I want to kind of touch on, you mentioned CleanSpark starting as, an electric company or an energy company, excuse me. And I think you guys got to start with microgrids. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly what we were. We were really at the microgrid side, so it was renewable generation, pairing it with batteries. And now we kind of consider ourselves to be in the macro grid business, although we're, of course, on the Bitcoin side of that, and we're not in the generation or storage or anything like that. We're in the consumption side.
Sure. Okay. What Yeah, so with those first, so it sounds like it was kind of a renewable project with batteries as the microgrid. What was the need for those? Like what was the purpose that those were serving, and that you guys identified with those?
We were building our business operating in what I consider to be the most fragile grid in the country, and that's in California. In California, you have, a big population. You have energy usages going up due to, the use in people's homes, but also they have a more rapid adoption of electric vehicles than other locations.
Yeah.
And then also they have the forest fires they've had issues with. So our projects were really for two purposes. One was for optimization of power. So basically, the peak use of times of power, of course, are more expensive in most grids, but extremely expensive in California's grid. And then from a resiliency point of view, California is notorious for blackouts and brownouts, especially in relation to the forest fire risks that they have over the summers, where they will shut down neighborhoods to avoid the winds, sparking,
Yeah.
power lines and things like that. So we were there for resiliency, and then for optimization of cost to the end users is really what we were there for. And then, of course, with the data center projects we did, which were military-based focused, that was really as an additional source of generation, because if their power lines got cut off, they still needed that data center to run. So you would isolate the key circuits in that data center to run their most critical infrastructure, whether that was communications equipment or something like that. That way, that data center could function even if it was cut off from the grid. So we did some pretty cool stuff with it, but it was resiliency and cost savings is ultimately what it was. And again, most of it was in California.
Yeah. Oh, very cool. So it was kind of power redundancy. The data center space is a little different than Bitcoin mining. It needs 5 nines, or a lot of them shoot for 5 nines as far as their uptime. So you guys were the power redundancy. Okay, cool. Very cool.
Yeah. And of course, there was usually multiple utility redundancies. It was almost like, think of our redundancies in those projects when it came to data centers as the redundancy of last resort. Again, from a military point of view, all the grid has been cut off and you still need the planes to be able to communicate, right?
Yep.
That we were that level of redundancy.
Oh wow, that's a that's a little different than like processing selfies and TikTok videos. So yeah, it's definitely a
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's a high priority stuff. Very
Yeah.
cool. So you mentioned that you got called out to. I think you said you got called to Georgia to take a look at a data center, and it was like, oh, well, this is a little different than the data centers that I'm used to seeing. When you started to kind of peel the layers back, and you said you did that during the pandemic, and take a look at like, okay, so what is this, and what is the opportunity here? Was it energy arbitrage, or you kind of teased it out a little bit that it's like this value like storage for energy? Maybe just kind of touch on like what was the opportunity or the like the aha moment when you were deep into studying this.
The aha moment actually came pretty quickly, and obviously because um, most energy projects don't pay for themselves. And when you're selling savings and you're the business selling the equipment and the batteries and the installation, if you want to make more money, your only option is volume. You just have to have more and more and more projects because if you put value into that, so basically if the customer pays more for what you're getting, their payback goes longer, right?
Yeah.
And also they have every base case is going to have its own limitations. When they need to be up, how they need to be up, how quickly they can turn up or turn down. And you end up with something who has all a project, let's just say a factory somewhere, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
all these limitations that are on it, and every single limitation chips away at the value proposition potentially, right? And when you look at Bitcoin, one, the true flexibility. It's not that it takes an hour to ramp up and an hour down, or a factory, for example. It can't just shut off the production line. In
Mm-hmm.
most cases, you would have spoilage or loss of whatever was on the production line if it's food or if it's a medical product, but even if it's any kind of product, uh,
Yeah.
flooring, right? You're now losing your product that you're ultimately going to sell. Bitcoin mining is really the only thing that can ramp up and down within seconds to truly react. And the quicker you can react when it comes to energy to any sort of need, signal, whatever it may be, price change even, right? Um,
Yep.
that allows you to capture more value or to give even more value if it's a demand response program, right? And so it becomes just worth more. And so you end up with payback timings. So, for example, I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the facilities we're building, right?
Yeah.
We build a facility, we are doing it to produce Bitcoin. And we will spend tens or even $100 million on a facility. We'll fill it full of miners, and for us, we have to basically earn that money back. Of course, right? We don't buy mining servers and build
Yeah.
buildings to not make money. And the payback times are couldn't be better. So if you think of it like real estate, you buy a real estate, we have facilities which are long-term, multi-year assets. I could put 5, 6, 7 generations of servers, hopefully, through those over the next 10, 15, 20 years. But I can get payback on those in, under 3 years or less. And then the servers, well, they have a shorter life. Let's say
Yeah.
3 to 7 years, depending on how difficulty goes and things like that. I can get payback on those at current prices and current Bitcoin. And again, we're still at, arguably in a bear market, in under a year right now. So what other kind of investment can you come forward and say, hey, my main driver of cost is these really big CapEx costs, and I need to earn all that money back as quick as I can to turn that into return to shareholders. There is nothing better when it comes to energy in particular that drives that value to transfer energy directly into value. Not and that's even just scratching the surface for us as
Yeah.
Bitcoin miners,
Yeah.
let alone to what that means to say proof of work, right? Proof of work. And I know I'm going a little bit down the rabbit hole here, But proof of work is essentially composed of energy and the work that the people put into it and the assets behind it. We're basically taking that value and putting it inside of a Bitcoin that is is a digital currency, can be transferred to somebody in any country, and they get that value now. That is why Bitcoin has value. So you asked what the aha moment really was, but it was one realizing that payback never made more sense for any energy project that I've ever seen in, the almost 10 years that we were doing
Yeah.
energy projects. And second was the ability to take value and put it in something, and to the ease of transfer, giving that value and transferring it to another country, let alone, when you traditionally you think of the transfer value of energy from one place to another across a power line, or you could put it in a battery and discharge it somewhere else. But like this is so much more efficient from a transfer of value point of view, that everything just made sense from there.
That's fantastic. And what I like is how you just laid your aha moment was very crystal clear. So I appreciate that, Zach. That's I mean, people are going to have to rewind and listen to that a couple of times because yeah, it's what makes Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining so special. You touched on like return times. I think that Bitcoin mining is poised to rock the world of energy generation in a big way just because of that fact alone. And so when some of these groups and large energy generators catch on, I think they're going to move a lot faster than people think.
I agree. But I think it's going to be interesting how they move. And here's where, there's sometimes a conversation about, the generators are going to adopt Bitcoin mining and it's going to help them maximize, their energy. There's a key problem with that argument, and I think this might have been where you're going, and that is two things. One, it's potentially risky. Boardrooms for energy companies are not made up usually of risk takers. And
Yeah.
two, though, in the U.S. in particular, in some areas, state by state, some it's federal, but really utilities are generally regulated to the maximum amount of profits they can take. And so if your maximum amount of profits you can take are, for example, there's a utility here, I won't name it, just for the sake of not naming it, but its profits are capped at 8%, right? And so if they generate 9%, they actually just have to rebate it back to their power users, which they're not really in the business of doing, or they have to disgorge it to the government, which actually happened a few years ago for that utility, right? So all that extra money they made, I think they had a 12% profit margin or somewhere about that. They had to take that 4% and basically give it to the state government, right? And
wow.
yeah, so they're now disincentivized from a revenue generation. So what we're really talking about is what they are incentivized for is maximizing the value for the power they have, ultimately to make the energy users around them happier. Because what happens for you and I when we pay our power bill, right? The power company has built into that cents per kilowatt hour a lot of things. One is the power we're using. The other one is the loss of the power as it goes through the power lines and through inverters and through the transformers. Every time it moves or changes voltage, there's a little bit of loss. And then they're also charging us for the power that never gets used. If you think about the magic of electricity, you walk into the room and you flip a switch. That means there had to be power that wasn't being used somewhere else that was now available to you. So you think of all the light switches in every city that we all live in that are not flipped on right now. That is the amount of, generation demand that these utilities have to be prepared to handle. And that means that there's going to be a lot of power waste. And so, bringing it back to the incentives, if we can use that power, it's not that the utility is going to make a ton of money. Maybe they max out their profits every year, right at whatever that percentage is. But also, that should allow them to make everybody else's rates lower. This is something that we're seeing in a very real way in some of the areas we operate in, that we're actually looking to do some more studies on to fully, prove out. But it should be driving lower cost when we participate in
Yeah.
market-based power, which we do in Georgia. We are market-based. We believe it's the right way to do it, and we think it's also the most efficient way when managed properly. It should ultimately result in lower cost power for everybody around us. And so if you step back, I do believe that that value is going to want to be captured by the same people that may have a utility, but I don't think it's going to be the utilities that do it. I think the utilities will partner with companies like CleanSpark, or companies like CleanSpark will get acquired by portfolio companies that are very
Yeah.
large that own utilities and also own other businesses. I'm going to name a company I think actually would be a perfect example that will never do it because of who's in charge of that company, but Berkshire Hathaway, right? Berkshire
Yeah.
Hathaway owns utilities. They also own factories that make ketchup. They should really own Bitcoin miners that supplement their total revenue, right? To me, that's like the common sense thing. But I really think that the obvious answer for utilities is really just to partner with companies like us, because that's what we believe. We're the I need to double check my numbers, but I'm pretty sure we're the largest one Bitcoin miner in Georgia right now. We expect with the expansion plans we have to definitely own that wholeheartedly inside of Georgia on a long term. We're spread across multiple utilities and we're partnering
Yeah.
with all of them. I think we're across 4 utilities now, and ultimately should drive value throughout the entire grid in Georgia. So I know I got off on a little bit of a tangent there, but that's how I see it shaping up, is that we will be a service provider the same way that most utilities don't own the battery banks that Tesla builds. Tesla does, and they get some sort of revenue share on it, or they get a benefit to the grid. We're there to benefit the grid, and the partnerships, I think, is the way it goes. Whereas utilities stay in doing what they do best, which is generation and transmission of that power.
Well, I mean, I love that perspective because, and I completely overlooked this. So again, there's so many little nuances to how this can all start to work together and how these partnerships can come together. I totally overlooked the fact that I think ERCOT is the only one not regulating the profit being made at these utility companies. It's a little bit of oversight on my part, but phenomenal point. So, Zach, you brought up kind of where I wanted to go next in the conversation is like the relationships, the partnerships. Maybe touch on what you and CleanSpark are doing in the state of Georgia and how you guys are embedding yourself and really partnering with the utilities there.
Yeah, so Georgia's interesting in the sense that it's so California, I mentioned, was one of the probably most fragile grids in the country. Georgia, on the other hand, is one of the most robust grids. And so it's a great place for us to set up, but also it's one of the only states that has been building nuclear power plants in the
Yeah.
last, 40 years. And they actually just commissioned, hit 100% power a few weeks ago on Vogel. So that's really what's driven us there. But what we have focused on and a little bit of history about how the utilities work out there is basically there was a single large utility that went bankrupt out there. I think it was in the 70s. And when it broke up and got put back together, basically got split into different pieces. So the transmission lines ended up owned by an entity, the generation facilities got broken up. But what's really interesting is there was 49 cities that formed a co-op, and they now own a percentage of, generation, transmission, distribution, and it's
Yeah.
allowed those 49 cities to run their own utility backed by the Municipal Energy Authority of Georgia, or MEAG. And so that's actually been a place where we have been focusing over the last couple years to really build in those areas. And part of the reason is because MEAG serves a lot of rural towns. And so, for example, we actually recently announced that we just turned actually 50 megawatts of power on at our most recent expansion. So we have 86 megawatts of power in a city called Washington. And we're expanding even more in Sandersville also. These
Oh,
towns
wow.
are small towns. I think Washington has a population of right around 4,000. Not including some of the surrounding areas that kind of spread out into the county. So small town, great people, but this was a city that has a very rich history, but factories were there and factories were then shuttered. And so
Yeah.
there's like underutilized infrastructure out there. There's also infrastructure that we've helped build over the last year or so out there. But there was no opportunity for tech jobs or anything like that. And when we have come to town, we're not only, one of the largest revenue or the largest revenue contributor to the city, but, we're a meaningful employer. Um, and so that's where we have been focusing our efforts is in these rural areas. And, something that's interesting is before Bitcoin mining came into town, these cities have pretty small city budgets. I'm not going to get into the details, but what I can say is before and after Bitcoin mining came into town, the city's been able to double its city budget. Now, some of that's
Yeah.
directed towards us and the revenue, and then paying we pay them for the power. They have to pay for some of that power. But you think of all of that revenue that comes together and goes to the city. We're also the largest sales tax payer in the area, and sales tax meaningfully funds the schools. So first, on the community side, that's how we partner. We partner by bringing real opportunities to underserved areas in Georgia. And then the second way that we partner directly with the utility is we schedule our loads with the utility. And we're one of a very, very few amount of people that actually does that because partially because Georgia is so robust, there really isn't a lot of programs. So in Texas, there's a lot of demand response programs and
Yeah.
ancillary services. And those programs are there because that grid needs people to turn off and turn on and be willing to shift load from one place to another. Georgia didn't really need that. Now, obviously, a grid still needs to have its grid health upheld. And so how we do that with MEAG is we directly schedule our loads. So they can see what we're going to be using by the hour all the time. And we
Oh,
can
wow.
also see from a rate structure point of view, because we are on market rates, we're on wholesale. And as those rates go up, that's the signal to us that obviously consumption is going up in the surrounding areas. And we just play economics is what we do, but that allows them to, again, because everybody's buying the wholesale, not just us, but our neighbors, we will turn down when it no longer becomes economical, but we will also see as a result of us turning down, the surrounding area power rates will also go down. So when we turn down, it benefits everybody. So this is the way that we're interacting with the grid. Also, again, we're buying power that would have otherwise gone nowhere. And that means if we're buying that power, it means it's not built in as a fraction of a penny to everybody else's power. So it is a little different because there isn't demand response and things like that. But that's how we participate on a day by day. The other way that we're participating is, we have funded expansion. So we have helped
Okay.
partially fund substations. We have funded power lines. We have done all of those pieces. And anybody that, some areas were right next to a substation, other areas were miles away. And the upgrades that we help fund, it refreshes a substation or builds a new substation. That it's not just us that uses it, but it's the whole community. And so our
Yep.
dollars directly benefit the ability for the community to expand. I'm going to use Washington as another example. The substation that just got commissioned, of which, we're going to be using about 50 megawatts, the city actually oversized it so that I think it's approximately 10 megawatts will go to other parts of the community for economic development. The city now can, build a new neighborhood. They can, put in retail. They can do whatever they want,
Yep.
but
Yeah.
we help make that happen. Whereas if they wanted to have an additional amount of power to do those things, they would have had to take additional risk of, hopefully if we build it, they will come. Instead, they knew that we were the captive audience that was already here, ready to go. And so that lets them build a 60 megawatt substation, knowing that 5/6 of the power we've already signed up to buy. And so that goes a really long way to actually fund um, new power infrastructure. Otherwise, it's hard to take the risk to pay to build those things, especially in rural areas.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Support for this episode comes from SunnySide Digital. Are you ready for the next Bitcoin bull run? Get ahead of the game by building out your Bitcoin mining infrastructure now. SunnySide Digital is your one-stop shop for everything Bitcoin mining, from transformers and switchgear to racks and miners. With a white glove approach to understanding your needs, they'll provide you with the hardware you need at the most competitive pricing possible. Say goodbye to your sourcing headaches and say hello to SunnySide Digital. Contact their sales team today at sunnysideinc.ca or via email at sales@sunnysideinc.ca. All right, now back to the show. Oh, yeah, 100%. And what's cool about that, I actually was not aware that you guys were working and partnering with co-ops. I'm in Minnesota. We have kind of similar to you in Georgia. We have a lot of co-op type power companies and a lot of municipal power companies. And unfortunately, Minnesota as a state is a net importer of electricity. We actually don't overgenerate, and so we end up as a net importer state. So unfortunately, we don't have as advantageous, of power rates and power, structure. But that's fantastic. And you're absolutely right as far as like you guys bringing the ability for these rural communities to get a little more aggressive on the expansion of the electrical system in the town, which then just leads to them being able to, like you said, new parks, new schools, new entire neighborhoods, et cetera. It's exciting to see that. And it's exciting that that's how you guys are partnering, and unique too, because most people hear Bitcoin mining and they automatically think, oh, it's just a demand response program is how they're getting cheap power rates.
Yeah, no, 100%. And there's ways to do it without it, and it works really well for us. And again, Georgia is a net export state, but this all actually allows them to keep the value that they have built in state, which is good for all parties involved.
Yeah. So I have to ask, with that type of relationship starting to happen, there have to be other people and other co-ops in the state, out of the state, that are looking at the work that you guys are doing and saying, you know what, we need to get in touch with CleanSpark and we need to see how this thing works. Are you guys starting to get approached by other co-ops, other energy producers, things like that? Is that something that's starting to hit your desk?
Yeah, we're definitely getting incoming calls from, all kinds of different places. And we're pretty selective about where we go, where we think we can drive the most value. And something that's good about Georgia is there's only, half a dozen, different players in town. And I think we're essentially, either, you know, connected at some point into their grids, whether that's Georgia Power or MEAG or Dalton. And there's very few other areas to go. So it allows us to spread out throughout the state with relationships we already have. We are getting a lot of calls from out of state, but we really think that part of our strategy is the area we picked. every once in a while we'll get
Sure.
a conversation comes up. Well, what about diversity of area? Well, expertise is just as value as diversity, in our opinion.
Yeah.
And, we do have plans on a long-term basis to be much bigger than just what we're doing in Georgia. But we really feel like we understand that grid incredibly well and know where to add the greatest value for ourselves and the grid. And we're going to stay pretty focused on that for the time being.
And I appreciate that because I think, the proof is in the pudding as far as how you guys have operated, and you guys are really showing you guys have dialed in and have that expertise. And I mean, you guys are growing at a very steady pace, and it's been fun to watch and awesome to see the growth and the work that you guys are doing. So I can appreciate that. I'm kind of switching gears in a little bit of a clunky way, but Bitcoin mining has, I don't know if you want to call it politicized or polarized, and people are now starting to kind of attach this negative connotation to it as far as like its energy consumption. Can you maybe touch on what CleanSpark is doing, from like the energy use is bad narrative, or maybe touch on like some of the ESG goals that you guys have as a company? Because you guys are pretty active in that too.
Yeah, yeah. So, we came from a renewable background. So from like sustainable energy use is important to us. And again, that's why we located in Georgia. It has a very large amount of carbon-free power. And most of that, again, is nuclear. We're of course huge fans of nuclear power. And that's really been where we've been making our camp on that. But I want to address from an energy use side, and then I want to go back to
Yeah.
kind of sustainability, renewables, and things like that. You know, I we've approached this from a mindset of abundance. And I think that scarcity versus abundance, when people, it's kind of a view of how people see the world, right? Either
Yeah.
energy is this scarce resource and there's not enough to go around. And that is true in some areas like California. And then there's other areas where it's abundant. And you can't take the power from Georgia and just give it to California. It's not how the grid works.
Mhm.
And so, that's been important that we're in areas with abundant power and that we're in areas that are actively building generation that is carbon free. Again, there is another nuclear plant that they are building right now. Also, an unknown fact about, or little known fact, I should say, not unknown, about Georgia. I think it's the sixth or seventh state for solar, actually. And, most people, when they think of solar, they think about, California and, the West Coast. No, Georgia's been making meaningful headway in the amount of solar that they're putting down there. And so, again, they're focusing on abundance, which is generation. And the generation they're building it the right way. You have really strong base load in nuclear. You then have your intermittent solar. And then they're
Yeah.
focused on the transition, which I think so many people miss. You can't snap your fingers and say, hey, let's quit using natural gas, right? A big portion of their grid, and we of course try to minimize our exposure to this where possible, but it is natural gas. But if you look at the amount of coal plants they have shut down, they've done better than almost any other state because they know that you can't just snap your finger, turn the coal plants off, and say, oh, now there's not enough power. Instead,
Right.
you know, 20 years ago, they started planning for this and they've been turning off coal plants. We met with the city and they were actually able to turn off a coal plant early because of the investments that we had, at least this is what they passed to us, that, us being there as a customer and the revenue they generated allowed them to make the transition a little quicker to turn off a coal plant that they were using as the city. Now, I don't know if the coal plant stayed on for somebody else, but they moved away from it because of the revenue that we were putting forward. And so again, look to Georgia, look to how they're actually shutting off coal. Some of that's getting
Yeah.
replaced with natural gas. Most of it, though, is getting replaced with nuclear power, which is carbon free, additional solar, and an additional generation. So that was also a focus when we looked at, hey, where should we set up home to grow? And if you look at a state, and this is something that I talk about a lot with my team, is strategy over ideology. Because there's so much ideology in Bitcoin that you really have to make sure you're thinking strategically and not doing it to do it, right?
That's right.
The same thing needs to go for the state we operate in and how they're doing their grid. We're already seeing, for any of you, and I think some of your listeners probably do if they're in the energy space, you start to look at the turn down schedules that are happening in the Northeast for, natural gas, coal, things like that. They're projecting, and I think it's we have a couple years before it gets tough, but in like the Northeast, 4 to 10 years from now, there could be energy shortages because of the speed of which they are turning things off without replacing it with additional generation. And then it's also intermittent generation. So you need a real plan.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the other reason we've chosen Georgia is their plan is based in what I'm going to call reality instead of ideology. And that is going to assure that there's abundance because I'd hate to be in an area where everything's great now, but in 5, 6 years, there's going to be shortages. That is not going to be a friendly place to be a Bitcoin miner because abundance is what Bitcoin mining thrives in. Abundance is what builds the ecosystem for us to give back. So again, that's why we focused on it. I think that's incredibly important as part of a strategic mindset for anybody in Bitcoin mining to consider.
Absolutely. The abundance aspect of it, yeah, it's just everything you just walked through is, you hope that people are looking at how Georgia is conducting itself, and then you start to model that versus what people are saying, and it's kind of like do what they're doing, not what they're saying they're going to do type of a thing, which is what you see a lot of going on right now. So maybe I guess to maybe kind of switch over and just on the flip side of things, maybe just to play like a little bit of devil's advocate, do you see any like challenges for Bitcoin mining and the energy grid? And I know that that's very broad because all grids are different and all geographies are different, but do you see in the future like any trouble with that much expansion, or is there really only trouble if mining is coming and it's not acting as a tool for the grid?
No, I think there's going to be a place for prosperity in Bitcoin mining on a long-term basis. Now, a little bit of insight on maybe how I see things. Obviously, I'm making a prediction about the whole industry, but
Sure.
so take it for what it is because this is many years down the road. But I believe that Bitcoin mining to be the best use as a tool in general will be smaller mines spread out throughout the grid. So think of it as almost like a grid saturation point of view. And as there's true saturation across the grid, that increases its utility. So if you go back to my aha moment, getting into this, it was about how flexible and how much value is added for XYZ reason, for Bitcoin mining. Now, one of those reasons in the future, I think, is going to be because grid balancing doesn't happen on its own, right? You need to send power to different places and transmit it across, and you can't get out of balance or bad things happen. But if you're able to spread 2 to 10 megawatts across, every couple square miles of, let's just say, the city of Atlanta, right? That gives you an incredible amount of flexibility grid-wide to balance everything out. And that value should be in a position again, in the future, that the utility just to be able to move up and down should ultimately be buying, incredibly low cost power, because that is power that would go to waste. It's the power of last resort, right? is the power they would have to dump off or on the grid just to keep an area in balance, right? And we would give a tool the same way that there would be a battery, except for we're consuming, and then we disappear when we want to move that energy back to other users on the grid. So I think that that's the direction it's going. This is why also, if you look at how we're building our sites, they're big, but they're certainly not what I refer to as a super sites. Our intention right now is not to build any gigawatt sites, right? Our Sandersville site's going to be very big, but that's probably as big as we'll ever go. And it'll ultimately be 230 megawatts, which is of course very large. But you'll compare that against maybe, some of our peers, and they've taken an approach where it's kind of the super site, concentrate everything in one place. The value you can add to the grid is immense when you're at key intersections.
Right.
But it's also limited because, again, transportation of power is usually the biggest constraint, right? And so I really think from a, 10 years from now vision, that's what Bitcoin mining is going to look like. There's going to be big sites near substation, near generation, near congestion points. And then you're going to see miners like us will own multiple sites throughout an area. And it'll look more like a milk run is how we would have our techs, manage and oversee these facilities. They'd be smaller. They'd bounce from place to place, just keeping everything in good working order. And I think on that trajectory, Bitcoin mining will always have a place. I think that super sites could find themselves isolated. A new city could get built next to it. Therefore, the grid constraints somewhere along that power line that may be hundreds of miles long in some cases in Texas, for example, suddenly the grid wants that power somewhere else and they don't want to give it to you. Therefore, the value you're providing isn't as high, right? So I do think that decentralized starts to look like a decentralized grid approach also. But I think it's going to take time to get there. Trust has to build, certainty has to build on Bitcoin mining. I think it's going to get there. And the last thing where I think it'll always add value is Bitcoin mining is going to start to shift from, like right now, we operate at 99% and we curtail very little based on how we operate. 'Cause we don't have to. It's economical. It makes sense. I think that, you think about next halving, and I'm already thinking about the halving in 2028 and, 2032. Probably 2032, and it could happen, during the 28th cycle. It'll be very common for miners to only run a few hours a day here, a few hours a day there. But the miners that are surviving and thriving will have gotten so good at being efficient and so good at maximizing their margins that's fine. It'll be acceptable because and it won't impact the security of Bitcoin because there'll be another mine in, somewhere else in the world that's still running. But I really think this 24/7 runtime uptime probably shifts in 8 to 10 years. And it could be even sooner than that, to where it's just very common for you to run overnight. And if you're lucky, it's during the day, but the margins will be there and it'll be a great business to be in. But again, that'll also probably drive a few other changes for, optimization.
I love that. And what's so funny about the timing of you saying exactly that last piece about, 99% uptime, probably shifting closer to like 30% uptime. Is I just had lunch today with a gentleman in the space that he said the exact same thing. And they are coming from a background of building energy production sites. So it's funny that you say exactly the same thing that he just said. And I value his insight into that type of stuff as much as I value yours. So it's two people with big insight saying the same thing. That's awesome. Just to be cognizant of the time, Zach, we kind of winding down the conversation. I wanted to ask you, another hypothetical question, but if you were sitting across the table from a power generator and they were looking at you like, I just don't get it. What would you say to them? Like, they just don't get why Bitcoin mining. What would you say to them, and maybe something to help them kind of start to understand why Bitcoin mining on their grid or for their grid?
Yeah, I think I would first approach it from the simplest way. And this is usually how we approach it if there's a new operator or a new generator, right? I would just say, do you know what it cost you for the power that nobody buys? And, most generators or operators worth their salt, that's a question they know. They know, that they spent X number of millions of dollars last year and only 64%, and usually it's less than 50% actually, got paid
Oh,
for,
wow.
right? Because they plan it into their rate structure to cover that, right? And it all depends on how, a lot of times it's distance, and there's a lot of factors that go into load loss, right?
Sure.
And really efficient operators are actually focused on always trying to reduce that. They want to reduce that number. They want to balance their grid better. But if they know that number and they can say, hey, it is X. And my next question would be, well, what if I just gave you even money for that, right?
Yeah.
Suddenly the light bulb goes on because all the other power they're, charging plus a markup. And then they realize, wait a minute, but if you paid me even money, I'm actually going negative on all that money, right? And then if that number was, it's usually fairly significant, the wheels start to turn, right? Now, the reality is we can't stop all load loss. So don't get me wrong, I'm not making a claim of that. But if we can take some percentage of what they are not getting paid for and turn it into revenue for them, which allows them to either run better, be balanced better, have less wear on their equipment, because ramping power up and down can wear on, depending on what the equipment is, it will wear on it. It will wear it out quicker. We give them a flat load. We're always there unless they don't want us to be there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything starts to turn over very quickly where they say, wait a minute. Most utilities, when they hear, oh, I'll be a flexible load, they see it as being measured in, on Saturday, if you tell me a week in advance, I'll turn my power down for 4 hours, right? When they had start to understand that, hey, next time there's a storm and you have an outage, 70 miles that way, and you want to, take power and shift it or manage it in a different way, that we can disappear within seconds,
Mm-hmm.
everything changes, because that is not a normal thing to ever see in the grid. So first, that's how I approach it is, first on a cost basis, what are you not getting paid for? And then second, what if I told you that I could move in seconds instead of hours or days? Or also, you don't have to schedule with me. You just call me up. For example, in MEAG, we basically schedule load 75 minutes in advance. Now that's their number.
Okay.
It's the easiest for them to work with because it's fairly high touch, not high tech. Um,
Mhm.
and as a result, we're both very satisfied with that. But we know that they could actually call us up 5 minutes before they needed something, or 1 minute, and we could, in an organized manner, shut everything down. And in Washington, for example, we could take 86 megawatts and give it back to the grid. And that, put that in perspective, the entire town of Washington is about 8 or 9 megawatts. So we can give
Yeah.
10 times the power back to that city with a minute notice. So that's just not normal. And when they realize that that tool could be added to their arsenal, um, everything changes for how a utility sees the world.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, the beauty of all of that is that, Zach, you guys have built up these amazing proof of concepts for people to go and look at, and because I would imagine a lot of people would hear that and be like, bullshit.
Yeah.
But you
I'd say,
you
come
could be
on
like,
down.
no, yeah, no, come here, come and check out the site, see what we're doing, see how we operate. It's fantastic. Zach, this has been an awesome conversation. I want to make sure I'm giving you, some room at the end here for a handoff for the audience. I want people to be able to get in touch with you, CleanSpark. So please tell the audience how they can get in touch with you guys.
Yeah, I would say, first check out the website, cleanspark.com. The CleanSpark also has a social media presence pretty much on every platform. And then you can find me on Twitter. I don't participate in many other things besides that, but it's just Zach K. Bradford is where you can find me. So love to interact with any of your listeners there, and appreciate the opportunity to come on the show. Look us up and see what CleanSpark's doing.
Awesome. Thank you, Zach. You take care.
Hey, thanks, Ben.